Amen. So, welcome to the fire, the snake, and the sovereignty of God. You'll see all of those pieces play out as we advance the lesson. This is lesson 36. Again, we'll finish, Lord willing, and we will Acts 28. Unless he comes during the lesson. If he comes during the lesson, I'm going to wrap it up and we're out of here. Just saying. So, where we were, obviously, Paul, under the guardianship of Julius, the Roman centurion, as well as other soldiers, as well as other Roman prisoners, left Caesarea and made the trip late in the year with the plan to make it to Rome. It really got perilous when they were leaving Myra. By the time they arrived in Crete, there at Fair Havens, you remember Paul said, we don't need to go any further. To do so, we're going to lose our ship, we're going to lose the goods, we may lose our lives. Ultimately, the centurion and the owner and the pilot decided, what does he know? And they took off, having no more, they were just going to go to Phoenix and weather there. Having no more than started slipping up the coast to head to Phoenix, a nor'easter descended on them, swept them out to sea. You remember the crew was worried that they were going to be dashed on the shallows, the sandbars in the Syrtis Major, Syrtis Bay. And so they were doing all they could. They had put bands underneath the ship. They really were fearful that they were going to wreck down there. Ultimately, though, they landed at Malta. They did not know where they were. They saw an island. If you remember to play the story, it was midnight, and the sailors started sensing that they were getting close to land. Likely they heard the water breaking on shallow islands, breaking on sandbars. They're at midnight. So they were concerned they were going to run aground, so they let down 4 anchors out of the rear of the ship. That stopped the movement of the ship. That stopped the advance of the ship and waited for daybreak. At daybreak, they saw the island. They made the decision. They cut the anchors loose, and they headed for the unknown island, which we know as Malta. Following the lesson, that's a picture of Malta there. Following the lesson, Rob Leacock came up to me and said, hey, when Chuck Missler taught through this, he said the ship has been found. And so by the time I had got to my house, Rob had already sent me multiple links, and it actually it's good to have friends. And it wasn't the actual ship that they believed they found. They believed they found those 4 anchors. And so what I've done is on our website, I created a new tile, Biblical Archaeology. Should have done this a long time ago, but this really caused me to do it. By the way, AI developed that tile for me, so it took me like 30 seconds to make it. And then I put a link to the full video, Search for the Lost Shipwreck of Paul. If this interests you, please check it out. It's 36 minutes, though it's well worth your time. But I couldn't let it go at just that. CBN actually, many years ago, did a news report on this. And so I'm going to play that news report. It's about 7 minutes. It'll sort of set the broadly, it won't give you all the details, but it'll give you enough to determine if you want to go check out the video or not. The video in the CBN video is a little poor. Audio's great, but the video in this is quite normal. So please forgive me for the video on the short little CBN clip, but this will give you a taste of what's in this longer video if you're interested.
It was sometime around 60 AD, and the Apostle Paul was en route to Rome from the Isle of Crete. On the journey, a fierce storm blew the ship off course.
On the 14th night, we were still being driven across the Adriatic Sea, when about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were approaching land. They took soundings and found the water was 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. When daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy beach where they decided to run the ship aground if they could. Cutting loose the anchors, they left them in the sea.
With the storm still raging, the ship struck a sandbar and began to break apart. The nearly 300 men on board swam for their lives. Miraculously, everyone survived.
Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta.
And so began a Christian influence in Malta that has continued down through the centuries. Today, Malta is Europe's most religious nation. 98% of its citizens are Catholic. St. Paul is memorialized across the island, nowhere more than in St. Paul's Bay, where tourists come to visit the shipwrecked cathedral and see the spot where most believe Paul's ship ran aground nearly 2,000 years ago. But when former Los Angeles crime scene investigator Bob Cornu paid a visit to Malta, facts in the biblical narrative didn't fit with the view from St. Paul's Bay. That difference led to a 10-year search for the true location of Paul's shipwreck. Bob started in the pages of his Bible. The crux of the story revolved around the 4 anchors. Could they be found?
And I looked at the Bible and said, could I solve this like it was a crime? Could I take the evidence that exists on the pages of the Bible and actually find these lost anchors that the Bible talks about?
Acts 27 and 28 gives a very detailed account, so Bob listed 4 factors that would have to match up in order to find the true location. A bay with a beach, a reef with a sandbar where 2 seas meet, the seabed at about 90 feet of depth, and a place the sailors would not have recognized. Cornu enlisted the help of a group of men who know the waters around Malta best, the Maltese fishermen.
So what I did is I started my search by going out with these fishermen that knew the weather, knew the currents, knew the topography of the ocean. They took me out with them and they explained to me all the possible places based on what the Bible narrative says to where the shipwreck of Paul could have been.
Most of Malta is surrounded by cliffs, so Bob quickly narrowed down the possibilities to a few bays with beaches. To figure out which site was most plausible, Cornu looked to Dr. Graham Hutt, an expert on Mediterranean storms.
I've been studying the storms and the weather patterns in the Mediterranean over the past 30 years. It resulted in a book on North Africa and Malta, which covers all these issues with the weather.
Dr. Hutt's expertise helped make sense of the clues in Acts.
They were really scared of getting dragged down into the Bay of Sirte, down on the Libyan coast, because they would have been trying as much as they could to head in a northerly direction, but only actually making northwesterly.
The only bay in that area that fits the direction of drift Bob calculated is called the Bay of St. Thomas.
In my opinion, bearing in mind where they most probably would have been, St. Thomas's Bay is a much more likely place.
We're just coming into St. Thomas Bay on the southeastern side of Malta, and the theory goes that this was the bay that was written about in Acts 27 and 28. Now, part of the biblical account says that the sailors didn't recognize the island and didn't know where they were until the villagers told them that this was Malta. And that is another support for the theory that this was the bay that they landed in, because if the sailors had landed on the north side of the island, there were many ports that they should have been familiar with. One day, Bob made an electrifying discovery. It came by way of an old diver with an incredible story.
I met a man named Ray Chancho and he said, hey, Bob, in the late 60s and early 70s, we dug up 4 anchors from the ocean bottom at about 90 feet depth.
The location? Just outside St. Thomas Bay, near a dangerous sandbar called the Moonshar Reef. The anchors were later donated to the National Maritime Museum. An expert analysis confirmed that they were from the Roman era, but the divers had no idea what they had at the time.
We found the anchors at the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s. I wouldn't remember the exact year, because, as I say, it was of no importance to me whatsoever when we found them. It was, yippee, we found a piece of lead.
Ray agreed to show us the area where the anchors were found.
Coming out to the head of Moonshar Reef. We're going to dive down and see if we can find the site where the anchors were brought up.
So when I went out and looked at the location where they found these anchors, I looked at the shoreline and it fit with what the Bible said. There was a bay with a beach. There was a reef where 2 seas come together.
Today, the seafloor is again tranquil and calm, giving no clues to the secrets that lie beneath the waves. It's impossible to know for sure if this is the spot where Paul's shipwreck occurred, but many Maltese are intrigued by the theory. Joe Navarro is another of the divers who helped retrieve the anchors.
I myself am convinced that it is more plausible that the shipwreck was on Moonshar, not on St. Paul's Island. We have believed St. Paul's Island, but nobody ever sort of questioned, but are you sure?
We looked down at this glistening anchor and I remember kneeling down and putting my hand on that cold object and thinking that I could be now touching history. For 2,000 years it belonged to the sea, and now I was actually touching this object that could come to us from the pages of the Bible.
Today, the anchors are tucked away in a corner of Valletta's Maritime Museum. Most visitors pass them by, having no idea what history they might hold. Chuck Holton, CBN News, on the Mediterranean Isle of Malta.
Of course, we'll never know for sure if that was the 4 anchors. It is important to note, and they didn't explain it here. You'll see it if you watch the longer video. One of the things that Bob did is he went to the Coast Guard because they have software that models how objects will be carried through the ocean at a given time of year. They placed the ship down at Sirtis Bay and then let the modeling carry it wherever it was going to carry it. It actually carried it to the south of Malta. So interestingly enough, the weather pattern at that time of year would have carried the object, an object of that size, to Malta, to the southern coast. By the way, just so you know, this is Malta. St. Thomas is located there on the island in case you're interested. But again, we'll never know for sure. But it is interesting, 4 anchors, 90 foot of water outside the bay where the software carried the ship. Chuck Missler said statistically it is highly probable that we've located Paul's shipwreck. Any questions about anything in the setup? You do have 14-point outline of chapter 28 in your notes. Anything that's gotten us to this point? We're on the island of Malta. Everyone has survived. Okay, let's get rolling. So the fire, the snake, and the sovereignty of God, you'll see all of those play out. Verse 1. After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. So just a couple of points here. I love how Luke says it, after we were brought safely through. After we came safely through this entire storm. After we were brought safely through this entire disaster. And as I was reflecting on that, it reminded me, God has never promised us He would take us out of the hard times. God has never promised us He would take us around the hard times. Quite the opposite. God has promised He would take us through the hard times. In fact, Paul expressed it this way to the church in Corinth. There's no temptation taking you, but such is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above what you are able, but will with the temptation make a way to escape that you may be able to bear it. Now, I realize I'm showing you the ESV and quoting the King James, but that's just because I read the King James for so many years. It's stored in my melon that way. But you get the point. It is often through much tribulation that God will take us through things, not around them, but rather through them. Think about Joseph. Think about Daniel. Think about Paul. In all those cases, through those events. But back to our story. So as the people are arriving on the beach, as they've swam, or for those who couldn't swim, they grabbed a piece of the ship and made it into the beach, all of a sudden the realization comes that all 276 have survived. There's a question in the back. Thank you, Noah. Noah was echoing Rich's question.
Your last slide where it talked about never being tempted beyond our ability reminded me of one of my favorite quotations from Mother Teresa. I know that God will never give me more than I can handle, but some mornings I get up and wish He didn't love me so much.
And again, we see that reality playing out in the life of Paul. But some of these difficult events are meant to bring glory to Christ. They're meant to exalt the gospel. So indeed, as Paul had said, the cargo has been lost. As Paul had said, the ship has been lost. As Paul had said that his God said, everyone has been saved. You can imagine if you were on that crew, you probably had a new appreciation for Paul's God as you watched all of this play out. And again, they've landed on an island. They didn't know what island it was. Only when the locals told them it was Malta did they realize where they were. Equally, as you're going to see, Malta had at least one port. So this wasn't the port. And of course, you wouldn't build a port where there's a reef where ships run aground. But at any rate, there are ports on this island. This was just not one of them. And they did not realize where they were at the time. And that brings us to verse 2. The native people showed us unusual kindness, so the Maltese people, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all because it had begun to rain and it was cold. Well, we said it was late October likely, so it's cold. and you're coming out of the water. Oh, and by the way, it's beginning to drizzle. It's beginning to rain. It's probably fairly miserable there on this island. But the good news is the Maltese people have watched this whole event. Many have come out. They've watched the shipwreck. They've watched it get destroyed on the reef. They've watched 276 people bail into the water and make it to the beach. And they go out, and Luke says they show us, again, Luke is still present, unusual kindness. We don't know exactly how much kindness they show, but you'll see what they did in verse 3. When Paul so they started this fire because it was raining and because it was cold. Verse 3, so we've got the fire. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the Maltese people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, no doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. We'll come back to that. So the island people kindle a fire. Paul's going out and grabbing sticks, because you can imagine this is probably a fairly large bonfire. There's 276 wet, cold, fresh out of the ocean people there. It's probably a fairly big fire. Paul's collecting sticks, and he gets to the fire and he throws the sticks on the fire, and a viper leaps out and bites him on the hand. The fire, the snake. Verse 4. When the native people saw this, you're going to see they make two conclusions based on the situation, based on the circumstances that they see. Both of those conclusions turn out to be incorrect. I say that because we can look at a situation and make an incorrect conclusion. We can say, oh, there's the situation, here must be why, and we too can be wrong. They are definitely wrong. So you can see what they did. They see everybody come out. They see what's happening. Paul drops this wood. This viper bites him on the hand. And they say, no doubt this man is a murderer. They become convinced that he's a bad guy. And here's what they say. Though he escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. Now, that's almost personifying justice. It makes us wonder, what are they saying? Well, the Greek word there is decay. Likely what they're referring to is the Greek goddess Decay, who is the goddess of justice. What these pagans are likely saying is, yeah, this guy's a murderer, and he escaped the sea, but the goddess Decay did not let him. She got him. She grabbed him. That is not only bad theology, it is an incorrect conclusion. But we hear this all the time. Some tragedy will hit, and someone will say, well, that person probably had it coming. It's probably karma. It's probably divine justice. I bet they're involved in some secret sin that nobody knows about, and that's what's going on here. That is an incorrect conclusion. We'll talk more about it. Verse 5. He, Paul, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They, that's the Maltese, were waiting for him to swell up or just suddenly fall down dead. Now, by the way, the waiting, that verb is in the imperfect tense. It's this idea of they were waiting. They were waiting. He's going to die. He's going to drop dead just any second. Give him a second. They're waiting. But, there's the conjunction, when they had waited a long time. They're waiting. They're waiting. He's going to drop dead any second. When they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds. And they said he must be wow, another bad conclusion. More bad theology leading to a bad conclusion. Again, these are pagans. So now they've said, well, a guy who can survive a bite by this venomous viper, well, he must be a god. That's the determination. So yet another incorrect conclusion. Both of these incorrect conclusions, though, are both just based on a faulty premise that we can be guilty of making. And it's this. When something bad happens, it must be because we deserve it. And when something good happens, it must be because that person deserved it, because they're a good person. And we fail to remember that that's not simply how it works all the time. God allows the sun to shine on the just and the unjust. He allows the rain to come to the just and the unjust. He allows good things to come into the lives of people who are in rebellion against him. And you ready for this? Even difficult things come into the lives of those who are his children. Now we know that when they do, Romans 8:28 is absolutely true. He's working all things together for good to those who love him. We know it's coming for a reason. And when it comes, we should first ask the question, Lord, is there some sin in my life? Is this discipline coming? If we're convinced there's not, then we should be asking, Lord, how are you going to glorify your Son in this? How can you use me to glorify Jesus in this very difficult situation? But here, the locals determine Paul is a god. Now, this is not a huge surprise. We saw this in Lystra. If you remember there, they thought Barnabas and Paul were gods. In that case, they thought he was Hermes, or what we would call Mercury. But here, the islanders think he's some god, although we're not told the name of the god. Now, I do want to make a spiritual point, just a point of application. Good morning, Martha. Was Paul people love it when I call him out. Was Paul a murderer? Yeah, he was a terrorist. He had killed Christians. He had punished them and tried to make them blaspheme. He was indeed a murderer. He was guilty of murder. But Paul would escape God's justice. Why? Because he had placed faith in God's Son, who had paid for Paul's guilty crimes. The same is true for you and I. All of us have sinned. We've all come short of the glory of God. We are all guilty, and we all should suffer divine justice. Yet by placing faith in Christ, like is pictured here, we can escape the venom of the serpent. The bite of the serpent can be nullified because of our faith in Jesus Christ. And here, that's exactly what happens. The fire, the snake, and the sovereignty of God. God had promised Paul, you will preach before Caesar, and guess what? Even a venomous snake is not going to prevent that from happening. Any questions as we're in the setup still of what's happening here on Malta? Okay. Verse 7. Oh, question.
I just wanted to know how old Paul is at this time.
I think we worked this backwards, Dean. I don't remember the exact number. Let me see if I've got a slide coming up. We're at slide number 229. Let's see if I've got it. I think I've got something. Maybe I don't. Maybe I'm lying. There we go. Okay, so this will give you an idea. We're at 60 AD. Jesus was crucified in 33 AD. Now we need to figure out how old was Paul when he was converted. If we say 20, okay, it's now 60. He's about 40. If we say 30, 60. Make sense?
What was his birthday?
Exactly. And when was he born now? And let me get us back to 229. There we go. Any other questions? Okay. Verse 7. Now in the neighborhood of that place, that's curious language for the ESV, but okay. In the neighborhood of that place, in the topos, in that area, in that city, in the neighborhood of those lands, of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island, a man named Publius, who received us, entertained us hospitably for 3 days. Okay, so just a couple of things here. First, there's this man named Publius. He is referred to as in the ESV, the chief man of the island. Is protos, that means first or head or chief, tes, nasos. He is the head of the island. He's the chief man of the island. He is the governor of the island. He is Maltese. His name is Greek. He's the governor of this island. We're told the governor, the guy in charge, received us. Again, Luke is still there with Paul. Now, I'm wondering, how many is us? Is us all 276? Is us Paul and Luke and Aristarchus, if he's still there? We don't know. We just know Luke says he received us. If it was all 276 and he entertained them for 3 days, that was indeed big hospitality, right, Deb? Whoa, that's a lot of people to receive at one time. We simply don't know, but that's what Luke records. I would just remind us, though, obviously we are to be hospitable to one another, of course, but we're even to be hospitable to strangers. Never forget what likely Paul wrote in Hebrews 13. But getting back to our story, so Luke says that he entertained us, he showed this massive hospitality, and that brings us to verse 8. And it happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery. And Paul visited Publius' father, and he prayed for him, and he put his hands on him, and he healed him. Okay, so a couple things here. Number one, we're told he had fever and dysentery. Okay, Stephen Gurr in his commentary says this illness was called Maltese fever. It was similar to malaria and was characterized by recurrent fever and dysentery caused by a microbe in the milk of the indigenous goats. So there would be this abdominal pain, there would be fever, there would be likely stool that's accompanied with blood, dysentery. And here Paul hears about Publius' father. Yeah, somebody says, ooh, that sounds fun. Publius' father, who has running this fever, he has dysentery, and he goes and he lays his hands on him and he prays for him, and the Lord heals Publius' father through the hands of Paul. Now, this should not surprise us. We've seen God heal and do many miraculous things through the hands of Paul. In fact, throughout the book of Acts, we've seen the apostles and their immediate associates, God did some amazing miracles through their hands. We're seeing it here again. But look what happens next, verse 9. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people, the rest of the Maltese people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. So you can imagine when the governor, when the leading man of the island, when Paul heals his dad, word spreads. Hey, that guy healed my dad. My dad was running a fever, had dysentery. He's been sick for a long time. That guy prayed over him, laid his hands on him, and he healed him. What did they do? Everybody who had a disease, they started bringing to be healed. Now, I do want you to see something here. I don't know if it's a big deal or not. Some scholars say it is. Some say it's not. I'll leave it to you. In verse 8, you'll notice Paul laid his hands on him, and we're told that Publius' father was healed. Then in verse 9, we're told they brought everybody who had diseases and they were cured. That's two different Greek words, which is very interesting that in the same narrative of a story, there would be one word and then a different word. Some scholars believe that what we're being told here is that through Paul, divine healing occurred. God healed through Paul. And then Luke was curing people with medicine. We do not know. I wouldn't make a big deal of it. Some people do. It could be that all of these were supernatural healings. Nonetheless, though, we see that God is healing people, whether divinely or through medicines. They're on Malta, and you can imagine that this is creating quite a stir in the Maltese people. And no doubt, as Paul is sharing the gospel, many are coming to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ there on Malta, explaining why 98% of the people to this day are Christians on this little island. And Scott has something.
Okay, so how could Luke be healing or curing those people if he just got shipwrecked? He didn't bring his little medicine bag. He brought the Holy Spirit with him.
Yeah, so that's one of the questions I have, Scott, right? When I told you some scholars believe, so did he bring his bag? Who knows? Did he know different herbs and all that were growing on the island that he could use? We don't know. Again, for those who make a big deal of it, I'm not sure there's a big deal to be had. I'll say a little bit more now that you've stopped me. Both of these words are used 5 times in the book of Acts. The other 4 times for the second word, which is where we get the word therapy, they're clearly divine healings. So I would argue that both of these words, in the context of Luke's writing, are used in other cases to refer to supernatural healing. So I would not make the big deal out of it, but I wanted you to hear it because some people do. And hopefully that makes sense. Verse 10. So Publius' father has been healed. Other people have been healed of their diseases. Verse 10. They also honored us greatly. Well, of course they did. I mean, they're healing everybody on the island who has diseases. And when we were about to sail, okay, so Luke gets ahead of his skis a lot here in this text, but they're not going to sail for 3 months. So he kind of telescopes a little bit. But when we were about to sail, they put us on board, providing whatever we needed. Now, I would assume the us in that case is Luke and Paul and maybe Aristarchus. I doubt it was everybody, all 276. It could have been, but I don't think that's what he was saying. But when they finally did put them on the ship, which took 3 months before they would go, they honored for sure Paul and Luke greatly and provided what they would need for the trip. And Gina has a question.
They don't say this, but I believe they honored them greatly, not because originally they thought he was a god. So they honored him greatly, not because they thought he was a god, but presumably because they were all converted and believed in the gospel, is what I would assume.
Gina, I agree with you. Again, what has been happening, and this is what's been happening throughout the book of Acts, God is continuing to validate that this is my messenger and what he's saying is true. And he's doing it supernaturally so that no one can say, I just don't see God in it. They see God working behind Paul's message, and I agree with you. They honored him greatly because he was their new brother in Christ, the one who had brought the gospel to this island. And we have no doubt if Paul was anywhere for 3 months, he was sharing Jesus Christ. He was sharing who he was and how you could have a relationship with him. But that's the setup. We're there on the island. We're getting ready to see they're going to be there 3 months, and then they're going to leave. But the good news is the Maltese people provided everything for sure that Luke and Paul needed. Any questions before we advance the story? Okay. Verse 11, make sure you have. After 3 months, so there it is, we set sail in a ship that had wintered in the island, a ship of Alexandria with twin gods as the figurehead. Okay, so a few things to talk about here. Number one, we see the most obvious. It was 3 months. They were there on Malta 3 months. Well, if we say they landed on Malta late October, then it's probably around February. It's getting safe to travel again. They're actually very close to Italy. So going from Sicily up to Sicily and then Sicily to Italy is all fairly quick. So they decide it's now safe to travel to make the short trip to Sicily and then ultimately to Italy. The centurion was able to find a ship that had wintered on the island. Okay, so clearly the island had ports. Clearly the island had ports of ships that were bound to Rome. But obviously that port, for sure, there wasn't one wherever they shipwrecked. There was no mention of a ship. And equally, you probably wouldn't build a port where there's a reef that can tear a ship apart. So probably in another port, they found a ship that was going to Rome. We're told it was a ship of Alexandria. Well, that's Alexandria, Egypt. That's exactly like the ship they shipwrecked in the bay. This was likely a grain freighter. This was likely probably from the same fleet, up to 180 feet long, able to carry up to 1,300 tons of wheat and numerous people. They found another ship of the Alexandrian fleet, likely a grain freighter, mated for Rome that had wintered. So it couldn't make Rome. It stopped early so it wouldn't be destroyed, went through the winter, and now the centurion has placed everybody on this grain ship. Fair enough. Then Luke provides us one more piece of information. He said that this one had as its figurehead the twin gods. Now, the twin gods are referring to Castor and Pollux, the sons of Jupiter and Leda. Now, you probably have never heard of Castor and Pollux or that they were sons of Jupiter and Leda, but you have heard of these two sons. Anybody know who they are? Gemini, whoever said it. We refer to them as Gemini. These were the patron gods of mythology we refer to as Gemini. They were patron god of sailors. Now, the Greek word here that they had a figurehead of the twin gods is a hapax legomenon. It's only used once here in the entire New Testament. It means that the ship was marked. Okay, that's a different idea than having a figurehead. The ship had a marking of the twin gods. Fruchtenbaum, well, that's the twin gods themselves. That's Pollux and Castor. Fruchtenbaum in his commentary said that Pollux and Castor, their images, were often painted or carved on each side of the prow of the bow of these ships. And that's what Luke seems to be saying. It was marked with the twin gods, likely on the front as honoring these gods so that they would protect them while they're at sea. Again, this is all pagan stuff. Verse 12. And putting in at Syracuse, we stayed for 3 days. So they finally, after 3 months, left Malta. They made the trip up to Sicily, to Syracuse, and they stayed there for 3 days. So a pretty quick trip from Malta, I can fit my roll right, all the way up to Syracuse, about 80 miles. Would have been a one-day jaunt. And so now they're in Syracuse, verse 13, and then we'll go ahead and I'll give you the text and then back to the map. And from there, verse 13, we made a circuit. We'll come back to that. And arrived at Rhegium, and after 1 day a south wind sprang up, and on the second day we came to Puteoli. So further, Luke says they made a circuit. Oh, I don't want to show you that yet. They made a circuit from Syracuse up to Rhegium. Now that word translated circuit means to wander or to roam. We don't know exactly what Luke means by that, but it likely does not mean they sailed directly. Something went on that they had to make a circuit. So whether it was because of the winds, we don't know, but they did something that the word would be to wander or to roam. So it's like they did not sail there directly, but ultimately they got to Rhegium. They're now on Italy. They're now in Italy. And then one day after that, the wind sprang up and they went up to Puteoli. So now they're just south of Rome. They're on Italy. Now, they would have sailed through the Strait of Messina. For those who are familiar with this area, it's about 1.9 miles in width. And so Tuesday night I was watching the news, and guess what the Italian government has announced? They're building a suspension bridge across the Gulf of Messina, 2.3 miles wide. I'm thinking, I'm not sure I want to ride on that suspension bridge. Their estimated cost is 12 billion euros. Yeah, if you can even imagine that. But again, nothing to do with our lesson. I just thought you'd find that interesting, that the Italian people are building a bridge over the very area there where Paul sailed through on his way to Puteoli, which we know as Naples, on his way to Rome. And that brings us to verse 14. When we found brothers, so they landed in Puteoli and they found brothers, we were invited to stay with them for 7 days, and so we came to Rome. Okay, so a lot of things here you're wondering, how did that really play out? There's 276 people. Surely the Christian brothers didn't invite all 276. Sure, they probably invited Luke and Paul and maybe Aristarchus. So where did everybody else stay for 7 days? We simply don't know. We're not told. But we are told that these brothers, when they heard about Paul, they invited Paul and Luke in, and they stayed with them for 7 days, no doubt showed them great hospitality. Now let's sort of get this in our mind, what's going on. So we're around 60 AD. Paul is getting ready to start 2 years of house arrest in Rome. If you remember, I told you that Paul wrote the letter to the Romans about 2.5 or 3 years before this. Okay, so these people had the letter to the church in Rome. No doubt they knew Paul by name. They had his letter. They were learning theology from Paul. And can you imagine to learn that Paul is just south of where we live here in Rome? And so they went out to meet him. They showed him great hospitality, and he stayed with them there for 7 days, we're told. Let's see, anything else? I guess that's it. Verse 15. And the brothers there, that would be the brothers in Rome, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and 3 taverns to meet us. On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. Okay, so here's what's happening. They're making their way to Rome, but the word of Paul's arrival is spreading faster than they're traveling. People from Rome start to come. Men from Rome start to come down to meet them. We're told 2 places they meet. They meet in the Forum of Appius. That's about 40 miles south of Rome on the coastline. And they meet at 3 taverns. That's about 30 miles south of Rome on the coastline. Okay, now we know exactly what's going on here. They're traveling on the Appian Way. They're traveling on the Via Appia. When they learn that Paul is coming to Rome, he's traveling on the Via Appia, they start making the trip south to meet him. The Via Appia is one of the most famous roads in Rome. Built in 312 BC, it spans 350 miles from the Adriatic all the way to Rome. It's made up of large stones that have really been cemented together over time. It's visible today. You can see many ruins lay next to the Appian Way. Again, it just extends from the Adriatic, from, I guess that's pronounced Brindisi, all the way to Rome. These people met up with Paul on the Appian Way, in 2 different waves, it appears. Now, we've talked about this multiple times, but you see it play out here. You see how encouraging these people were to Rome, or to Paul, and you see how encouraging Paul was to them. Can you imagine? You have the letter from Paul that's explaining the gospel of Jesus Christ, that's helping you understand it. He's a rock star in your mind. This is the Apostle Paul, and guess what? You learn he's landed on your coast. You can imagine, as a believer, you might very well make the 40-mile trip on foot to meet the Apostle Paul. That's exactly what's going on. Now, before we leave here, I do want to remind you of Paul's great desire to go to Rome. I want to repaint the picture for you. And so I'm going to show you just a few verses so that you get into Paul's shoes about how badly he wanted to be in Rome, how much he wanted to share the gospel in Rome. He knew there was a church there. He wrote a letter to believers there, but he wanted to go there too. And so the first one comes from Romans 15. Again, we said this was written, 2.5 or 3 years before where we are right now. It was in the letter that went to Rome, and here's what he said. Having done all this work in Asia Minor and Macedonia, having completed all this work, this is the reason why I've so often been hindered from coming to you, because of the work there. But now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions, since I've saturated the gospel in these regions, and since I've longed for many years to come to you in Rome, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain, and be helped on my journey by you once I have enjoyed your company for a while. He just opened up his heart in this letter and said, listen, I'm looking forward. I've been longing to come to you as I go to Spain. I've been longing to stop by and share the gospel with you and even be helped by you on my way to Spain. She's like, listen, I want to share the gospel with you. I want to spend some time fellowshipping, and then I want you to help me get to Spain. I want to take the gospel even to the outer reaches of the Roman Empire. A couple of verses later, he said this, referring to what's going on. For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints at Jerusalem. We've talked about this. This was the third missionary journey. This was when he was collecting money to take back to the poor saints of Jerusalem. For they were pleased to do it. And indeed, they owe it to them. They owe it. The Gentile saints owe it to those believers in Jerusalem. For if the Gentiles have come to share in the spiritual blessings, they ought also to be of service to the Jewish believers in material blessings. When therefore I've completed this, and have delivered to them what has been collected, I will leave for Spain by way of you. As soon as I drop off all that's been collected, I'm going to Spain, but I'm stopping at your pad first. Now, Paul had great plans to go to Rome and ultimately to Spain. Here he is in Rome. He could have never imagined he was going to go like this. He could have never imagined he was going to be a prisoner in Caesarea for 2 years under house arrest. He could have never imagined he was going to go to Rome in chains. But his great desire to be in Rome has fulfilled. In fact, he ended it this way in verse 29 of Romans 15. I know that when I come to you, I will come in the fullness and the blessings of Christ. What he didn't know is he would come with Roman chains. But God had gotten our brother to Rome as he had promised. He had gotten him there safely, and he would declare the gospel in Rome, the center of the Roman Empire. Verse 16. And when we had come into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him. Okay, so he gets to Rome. Because he's not a condemned prisoner, he's given a lot of freedom. It appears that he rents his own house. He rents his own apartment there in Rome, and people can come visit with him. You can read the prison epistles, and you can see the different people that visit with him, for sure, that are mentioned. And he has a soldier who's guarding him. Likely this soldier was chained to him. Likely rotating in 4-hour shifts. Can you imagine if you were a Roman soldier and you were chained to Paul for 4 hours while Paul's awake? What you might hear about. Yes, Trish.
So was this soldier to guard Paul from harm because the Jewish people wanted to kill him? Or was this because he was not a prisoner but uncondemned?
So both are true, I think.
Oh, okay.
So it's a great question, Trish, and I think the guard was functioning as both. He was uncondemned, but there were charges made against him, right? So he wasn't in the sense like a free man like that. But the charges, he had appealed to Caesar, so in that sense, he was being protected and given great freedom. And this is going to come back around here in a moment. We've got more to say about it. But I want you to see that they're in Rome, and Paul's going to be there for 2 years. You'll see in a second. He has great freedom. His people are coming to minister to him, and he has a Roman soldier who's chained to him. Any questions before we continue to advance the story? As Paul is now in Rome, he's going to be there for 2 years under house arrest. Verse 17. After 3 days, he called together the local leaders of the Jews, and when they had gathered, he said to them, let's pause right there. Okay, so 72 hours after arriving at Rome, Paul is immediately calling for Jewish leaders. He's immediately dispatching, however they dispatched it, to get word out to all the Jewish leaders in Rome to come to him. He had something to say to them. Now keep in mind, from their perspective, from the Jewish perspective, Paul was a Pharisee. Paul was a Pharisee, a Benjamite. Paul was a Pharisee who had recently come from Jerusalem. They would want to hear him. He would have clout with them. This was the most religious, most conservative sect of the Jewish religion. He was a Pharisee. And so he called for these Jewish leaders. You're going to see once again what plays out everywhere Paul goes. To the Jew first, and then to the Gentile. That's exactly what's going to happen. He starts with the Jew, as he always does. So he invites these Jewish leaders. He has something he wants to say to them. We're now going to read in totality what he says to them and what happens. So picking back up in verse 17, he said to them, brothers, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers, yet I was delivered as a prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. When they had examined me, they wished to set me at liberty because there was no reason for the death penalty in my case. But because the Jews objected to me being released, I was compelled to appeal to Caesar, though I have no charge to bring against my nation. Isn't that interesting? It's not just their nation, it's his nation. Verse 20, for this reason, therefore, I've asked to see you and to speak with you, since it is because of the hope of Israel that I'm wearing this chain. Now, in your notes, I give you 8 heads that Paul's working through. You can see them play out his address. He refers to them as men and brothers. You see the camaraderie. He loves fellow Jews. Although many have tried to kill him, he loves them. He lays out that he's done nothing against the Jewish nation, nor nothing against their customs. Number 3, he explains that they handed him over to the Romans. That's a way of explaining the Jews were beating me to death and the Romans showed up and took me from them. Verse 18, he explains that I've defended myself before the Romans. No one has found me guilty of anything that deserves death. Obviously, he's referring to when he gave his case before Lysias, the commander, before Felix, before Festus, before King Agrippa. Everyone has determined he was innocent. But because of the Jews, he had to appeal to Caesar, and someone has a question somewhere.
I love to irritate Rob.
I'll get a drink of water.
He said, I read it as, I had no charge to bring against my nation. In other words, they put him through all of this and everything, but he wasn't, what is the word I'm looking for? He wasn't throwing it back at them or holding it back at them, right?
Point number 6 in the running 8 points head, you're exactly right. He looks at his fellow Jewish leaders, his brethren, and says, I don't have a charge to make against them. Now, they had a whole lot to make against him, but his point is, I have nothing to say against them. Again, I'm taking the high road. I'm telling you, he boils it all down. Point number 8, I am here because of the hope of Israel. Once again, he's referring to the Messianic hope. Once again, he's saying, I am here because I am proclaiming that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus of Nazareth is the promised Messiah. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm wearing these chains, because they went crazy when I said that. They sought to kill me when I said that. The Romans, they all found me innocent. They found nothing deserving death or imprisonment. But my fellow Jews who did not become believers, they wanted to kill me. And to protect myself, I had to appeal to Caesar. Because when I was there before first Festus and ultimately Felix, I was concerned he was going to turn me over. And so I had to appeal to Caesar. But the punchline, I'm here because of the promised hope of the Messiah. And that brings us to verse 21. A little surprising, in all honesty. They said to him, these are Jewish leaders, we've received no letters from Judea about you, and none of the brothers coming here has reported or spoken any evil against you. Now, on the face, that's a little surprising. But now keep in mind, there's been a lot of passage of time. Paul was a prisoner in Caesarea for 2 years before he started this voyage. So this has been better than 2 years that Paul has been out of circulation, right? Paul has been under some form of control by the Roman government. And so these leading Jews say, we've heard nothing. We don't even know what you're talking about as far as you and any problems. Verse 22. But we desire to hear from you what your views are, for with regard to this sect being Christianity, we know that everywhere it is spoken against. So these Jewish leaders say, listen, We desire to hear what you have to say. We've heard nothing bad about you from the Jews in Jerusalem, but we do desire to hear what you have to say because we've heard about this sect, and the Jews everywhere are speaking evil against it. So you can imagine they're listening. Every Jew that we talk to, they have a lot of bad things to say about this sect. Again, they saw Christianity as a sect of Judaism. A heretical sect, of course, because it was claiming that Jesus was the Messiah, but they saw it coming out of Judaism proper. And just so you know, the Sadducees were called a sect in Acts 5. The Pharisees were called a sect in Acts 15. It just means someone who has a different teaching, but in this case, they saw his teaching as heretical because they rejected that Jesus was the Messiah. But they did say, we want to hear you on this matter. And you can rest assured Paul has something to say. And that brings us to verse 23. Any questions before we advance? Okay.
Dean, anything, Dean?
Verse 23. When they had appointed a day for him, so these Jewish leaders appointed a day when Paul would explain what he believes, they came to him at his lodging. So this would have been his house or apartment where he's under house arrest. Oh, the Roman guy who's chained to him today is going to get a lot. And they came in greater number. So it wasn't just the Jewish leaders now, it was Jews from Rome. The word had spread, a day had been set where Paul was going to explain why he was a Christian. Paul was going to explain why he adopted the teachings of this sect as they saw it. And from morning till evening, he expounded to them, testifying to the kingdom of God and trying to convince them about Jesus, both from the law of Moses and from the prophets. Can you imagine? From morning to evening, he expounded, he set forth, he declared to them the kingdom of God and how Jesus was the promised Messiah. He tried to convince them, arguing, using logic, using his understanding of the law and the prophets, that Jesus was the promised Messiah. Can you imagine being there that day as Paul spent a day pulling out Old Testament verses saying, and look at this, yet another proof that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, we have no idea what verses he pulled out. I grabbed some. So I grabbed Jeremiah 23, that he would descend from David. I grabbed Isaiah 53, just the first 5 verses. We could have grabbed the whole chapter, but I didn't want to sit there and read that much to you. I grabbed Isaiah 61. The Spirit of Yahweh is upon me, Jesus said. Again, can you imagine what it would have been like to be there that day as Paul just started parading the law and the prophets to prove that Jesus was the promised Messiah, and even that he was predicted to die, Isaiah 53, and rise from the grave. That's what he spent his day doing. You can imagine it would have been incredible. Verse 24, and some were convinced by what he said, but others disbelieved. Now, we've seen this over and over again. Paul preaches, some people believe, some people reject. This happens in our life. We share the gospel, some people believe, some people reject. And so it's happening again. There's no surprise here, but look what happens next. So he's shared this all day long. Some have received, some have rejected. And then we read in verse 25. In disagreeing among themselves. So now picture Paul's there. They're in a large room, likely together. Paul has shared all this. And now they're talking internally. He's probably wrapped it up. He's taking his lapel mic off, putting his laptop back in the bag, right? He's doing all this stuff. And they begin talking among themselves. He can hear them. He can overhear them talking. They're probably getting more and more spirited as they talk. They begin disagreeing among themselves. He hears it. And they departed after Paul made one statement. Okay, so they're there debating. They're there arguing. They're there discussing. Side A is saying cannot be, side B is saying has to be, and Paul is hearing it, and then Paul says something that causes them to break up and go on. Let's look at what he says. He actually quotes Isaiah 6, and here's what he says. The Holy Spirit was right in saying to your fathers through Isaiah the prophet, go to this people and say you will indeed hear but never understand, and you will indeed see but never perceive. For this people's heart has grown dull, and their ears have become to the point where they can barely hear, and their eyes have been closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn, and I would heal them. When he said that, when he quoted Isaiah 6 and said, that applies to you, they got fired up and left. I imagine so. Now, just a moment about these verses. How much time do I have? 10 minutes? Perfect. This quote is from Isaiah 6, which Isaiah gave before the Babylonian captivity, which happened in 586. Its ultimate immediate fulfillment was in that captivity. What he does is says, this prophecy that was fulfilled in 586 has application to you and the way you are behaving today. So I'll read you a little bit more of the prophecy, and then we'll make the application. So God speaking to Isaiah the prophet, he tells Isaiah, go to this people. Again, this is around 586 BC. Go to this people and say, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not deceive. Make the heart of the people dull and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. Then I said, how long, O Lord? And the Lord said, until cities lie waste without inhabitant, and houses without people, and the land is a desolate waste, and Yahweh removes this people far away, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. And that is exactly what happened. He prophesied all the way until the Babylonian captivity, until God marched Judah and Benjamin off out of the land because of their sin. And here's what was happening. They were hardening their hearts against Yahweh, and Yahweh began to harden their hearts. And ultimately it led to their destruction and their captivity. And Paul is saying, you are behaving just like our brothers 600 years ago when they rejected Yahweh. So are you. You can imagine, extremely frustrated and angry. They left. And that brings us to verse 28. Therefore, let it be known to you that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles, and they will hear it. They will listen. They will respond by faith. And that is exactly what we've seen in the book of Acts. If we replay this movie all the way back to Pentecost, it was a little church that bloomed into a larger church, but it was all Jews and Jewish proselytes. And now the gospel has gone around the Roman world, and the church that started principally Jewish is now a church that's principally Gentile. They indeed, over almost the last 27 years, have heard, have responded, and have placed faith in the Messiah. Any questions before we wrap up the book of Acts? Verse 30. Oh, question. Greg.
I have a question. Paul, he had appealed to Caesar, for him to come to Rome.
Say that again, Greg.
He had appealed to
Yes.
Caesar,
I'm sorry. I missed the word. Yeah.
to come to Rome. What I'm wondering, is there a record of, did he actually meet with Caesar, or did that require him to actually?
As best we understand it, he would have given his appeal before Caesar.
Okay.
It's not recorded, though.
Okay.
So it's not in the book of Acts.
I didn't know if his talking with the Jews there, was that part of it, or
We don't think so. We think he would have given a formal appeal, but he likely never gave it.
Okay.
And here's why. Well, look, just hold right there. So likely he should have appealed before Caesar. He likely never did. And we'll see why in just a second. I'll tell you why. So, should have appealed, should have appeared, likely did not. Verse 30. Am I on the right verse? Yeah. He lived there 2 years at his own expense and welcomed all who came to him. Okay, now you should be wondering, 2 years? 2 years? Why was he living in Rome for 2 years under house arrest? Well, before I answer that question, let's just unpack some things. Number one, he's there living at his own expense. As you read the prison epistles, you're going to see many people, he meets many people come to him and minister to him. And it's during this time that he writes the prison epistles. He writes Ephesians, he writes Philippians, he writes Colossians, and he writes Philemon. Now, I do want to show you one thing he wrote to the church in Philippi. I want you to see it because it sort of sums up what's going on here as he waited for 2 years. As he's writing to the church in Philippi, which is one of the epistles that was written while he was imprisoned in Rome, in the first imprisonment, he says this: I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. What? Locked up on house arrest in Rome, advance the gospel? Wait a minute, I thought the gospel could only be advanced when I'm comfortable. Look what else he says. So that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard of Caesar and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. The whole imperial guard, as they're taking turns being chained to this man, are hearing the gospel, and they all understand why he's here. He's here because of Christ. He's here because of the gospel. But look at what he says next. You want to know how our sovereign God works. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment. Well, wait a minute. Seeing the leader of the movement in prison would bring fear and trepidation. That is not what happened. Look at what Paul says. Throw a piece of candy on the ground. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Paul said, you know what else has happened? My imprisonment has called all the brothers here in Rome to become extremely bold, and they're sharing their faith with everybody. It's not caused them to become weak and mealy-mouthed, quite the opposite. They've become confident. Guards saved, believers emboldened, the gospel furthered. Now, why 2 years? Here you go, Greg. Fruchtenbaum in his commentary says this. Under Roman law, 2 years was the length of time accusers had to present their case. If they failed to show up within that time frame, as was true in this case, the accuser would be released by default. So likely he was supposed to stand before Caesar and give an answer for his crimes, and Caesar would make a decision when he heard both sides of the story. Caesar likely never heard it because they likely never came. Now, we understand likely why they never came. They probably didn't want to go before Caesar and tell too many lies. That might cost you your life. And then equally, it was a very long trip from Jerusalem to Rome. And let's be honest, they're probably thinking, hey, do nothing, and we got Paul on ice for 2 years. We got him out of ministry. Oh, hardly. Oh, hardly. You've dropped him in the darkest place on the planet at the time, and he's sharing the gospel with everybody. You would have done yourself a favor to try to get him out of there. But there he is preaching the gospel, and that brings us to verse 31. He was proclaiming the kingdom of God and teaching about the Lord Jesus Christ with boldness. That means confidence is what the Greek word means. And without hindrance. That is another hapax legomenon, only used here. It means without interference. Now think about this. Everywhere Paul has shared the gospel, he's done so with great hindrance. He's been interfered with. They've tried to stop him. They've tried to beat him up. They've stoned him. They've done everything they can. For 2 years, he was in the heart of the beast of Rome, preaching the gospel without hindrance. The Jews did not win the day. God won the day. And the gospel went into the heart of Rome. And
did he get to Spain?
We do not know. Great question. That'll be a lead-in. So before I say anything else, how much time do I have? Do I have 120 seconds?
No, you do not. You're
Okay,
out of
60
time.
seconds? Okay.
You're out of time.
So let me say something. I'm going to wrap us up. I present to you the book of Acts. Okay. I'll end here. One of the questions that's often asked is, well, what happened next? The book just ended. Like he's still under house arrest. It just stopped. What's the rest of the story? If you're interested in understanding what the rest of the story is, and did he by chance make it to Spain, I would direct you to a document I uploaded Saturday. Was it Saturday, Kristen? I don't know, whatever day. It's entitled Paul's Final Years. I make 5 major points, and I back them up both biblically and with extra biblical sources, historical sources. So if you're interested in what we think happened next with Paul, I outline those topics. I'll give you my point on Spain. I don't think there's enough evidence to know for sure. He definitely wanted to go to Spain. What a book. Let's pray. Father, thank you for our 36 weeks.